Okay, and which one are you going for, Armel? You chosen yet? Okay.
Humanism, evolutionism. 71.
71, okay. Good. Well, I think we'll start with, I do the oldest one first, so by definition we'll do evolutionism, because evolution's been going on a long while, whereas New Age is kind of new, and it's a new religious movement. So yes, evolutionism. Okay, it's an interesting one, because many different cultures have reached a sort of thought process that maybe life evolves, maybe... I mean, the ancient Egyptians had a sort of theory that life came from the dung beetle and was, somehow came from the mud, that there was a sort of life force inside nature. And the Greeks had that idea in a very disciplined and thought out way. When they started doing philosophy, I mean, Thales said life began with water, one of the first pre-Socratic philosophers. And of course that's true. I don't think life exists without water. So in a sense, and he was Phoenician, from the coast of what is now Turkey. And these early philosophers worked out there must be some kind of evolutionary process behind life. Aristotle also had the same insight, and he was very interested in the question of where life comes from. What's the difference between living matter and organic matter and inorganic matter? He wrote about this, and he basically got very close to the idea of evolution, but didn't have a theory, a mechanism how it could work. The Roman philosopher Lucretius wrote a famous poem on nature which puts forward the idea of evolution. And he says life happened through nature, through material forms and processes that interact, and then each species comes along that is faster, better, flies higher, swims faster than the others. There's a sort of evolutionary thrust going on in life, which Bergson called the élan vital. And some of the French philosophers, fast forward to the, through the Renaissance and on into the early Enlightenment period, some of the French philosophers, Buffon particularly, came to this same idea of evolution. And the father of Charles Darwin, Erasmus Darwin, also wrote a poem about evolution. He was a medical doctor, and he wrote another great poem about how life evolves. And around this time they're beginning to find fossils and things, traces of former types of life. Even Leonardo da Vinci knew about fossils, and he drew them, and he speculated that these must be earlier primitive life forms. And other thinkers in Germany, a man called Oetinger, Oetinger, and Franz von Baader and Herder, they wanted an evolution that included a psychic aspect, a spiritual aspect, that the physical forms of life are like vehicles for spiritual being, and that soul is also part of the evolution of life in some way that they couldn't explain. Even Hegel talks about this, and Schelling particularly, a great friend of Hegel, an idealist philosopher. He believed nature is a vehicle for soul to manifest greater and greater complexity. But Charles Darwin, who put forward the theory of evolution by natural selection, didn't agree with that. He was a pure materialist who believed that you could explain it through what he called evolution by natural selection. and he wrote this up as a treatise. And, you know, it's something I've studied quite a lot because Darwinists are still very dominant in English academia and in the natural sciences. But I prefer a man called A.R. Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a colleague of Darwin, friend of his. But they differed on this very important point because Wallace said there's a spiritual side to evolution. And he was an open-minded man who'd been to consult with spiritualists, like Allan Kardec in France was doing, launching spiritualism here in France. They were doing it in the US and in Britain at the same time. Even Prime Minister Gladstone and Queen Victoria was going to spiritualist seances. So was Abraham Lincoln, the president. It was the done thing in Victorian times. And Wallace did. And he had enough personal evidence, mediums telling him stuff they couldn't possibly have known, that he was convinced that the soul lives on. And so the question is, where does the soul go? How does it evolve? Is there a spiritual evolution process? The great French spiritualist called Allan Kardec, he began as a scientist. He was a student of, educational philosophy, and he was a scientist. He wrote books on mathematics. But then he became a spiritualist because he was convinced by the mediums. They were not making stuff up. They told him stuff that nobody outside his family could have known. Yes, so then, but this debate still goes on. So Marx was very much on the Charles Darwin side. Materialism, only that counts in evolution. And in fact, he dedicated Das Kapital to Darwin, which kind of tells us where he's coming from. But other thinkers were more subtle. Henry Bergson was someone who believed in evolution, but he believed in the evidence of the spiritualists, and was president of the Society for Psychical Research in London, which I used to belong to for many years, which looks at actual evidence of paranormal phenomena and things. So there's lots of questions. Another great Russian thinker, Vernadsky, when I went to Moscow and talked to Russian philosophers, they were all, in love with Vernadsky, who was like a proto-Green. He thought life was one universal field phenomena. Every tree, every blade of grass, every human, we're all interconnected by a sort of life field. And that's all evolving. We're all interconnected. And he lived at the same time as the Bolsheviks, but he kept his head down and just got on with science. So he didn't, you weren't allowed to be an idealist in those days in Russia, because Lenin had said you're not allowed to be an idealist. But actually, secretly they were. When I went to Moscow and met these great philosophers, they all had come out the woodwork and said, yeah, of course we're idealists. We all believe, as Plato did, there is a spirit evolving. And they were doing some brilliant work in Russia. It's a great shame they've been taken over by this rogue taxi driver from Petersburg, a junior intelligence agent who hasn't got a clue what philosophy means. Teilhard de Chardin, another great French thinker, Jesuit, who was a paleontologist. He was very interested in evolution, but he thought again that the point of evolution is to perfect the human soul, and that ultimately we're here to learn how to love, which we can't do if we're just material bodies. That's a metaphysical thing. We're working towards what he called the omega point, which is when love becomes the dominant modality of our being. And he believed Christ was a way shower for that. He was an evolved soul who taught us how to love effectively. Ernst Laszlo is a great Hungarian intellectual who set up a group for evolutionary studies in Budapest, and he's busy with all this. David Loy and Ryan Eisler, two other great thinkers who were part of Laszlo's circle of evolutionary studies. And there are people now, colleagues in the Scientific and Medical Network, who are studying the details of all this and how spirit and matter interact to cause evolution. It's really fascinating field, actually. Yes, and I mean, one thing I do think is that nuclear weapons and World War III and violence are an evolutionary dead end. This is why I'm so into peace. I mean, yes, war has a certain evolutionary advantage in that the tribe or nation that wins the wars tends to survive. And also war can be good for science. It can stimulate things like the internet or, you know, cryptography and research and so on. But only up to a certain point. If war then becomes the only thing that we do, it's self-defeating. And if we create weapons of mass destruction, that's the end of evolution on this planet. We reduce it to smoking rubble. So if you're into evolution, I think we've got to be for peace. And what we've got to find out is a way of onwardly evolving humanity that is as exciting, as interesting as war, but doesn't involve mutual killing. But can involve, yes, there'll always be conflict, there'll be differences. There'll be, let's do it that way. No, let's do it this way. No, this way is the best. There'll be those kind of conversations. But we needn't try and destroy each other. We can do it in a more French way, intellectually, so to speak. So that's my take on evolution, if you want. I've been studying this week a French philosopher if I had my notebook, I would share more details of. Oh yes, here he is. Who was talking about this stuff? Quite interesting guy, I've discovered. Who influenced Emmanuel Levinas, a great French philosopher, who talks about he knew Heidegger, he knew Cassirer and Husserl. This is a great French intellectual, Emmanuel Levinas, and he was Jewish. He wrote about, and he survived the prison camps of World War II. He was incarcerated because he was in the French army. They captured him. But they didn't kill him because, incredibly, they didn't kill French army officers. And even though they knew he was Jewish, they let him live. And he said he loved his prison camp because he did more reading than he'd had time anywhere else. You know, he read the whole of Hegel and all this kind of thing. So he came out, he studied, he did his doctorate and stuff on Hegel and Husserl, and he argued that what's important about human beings is that we care for others. This care that we have for the other is at the root of what it is to be human. And he critiqued other philosophers that forget that. So ethics is part of ontology for him. Now he was influenced by another French philosopher I've just really discovered called Maurice Blanchot, who lived from 1907 to 2003. A bit of a dark horse in French philosophy. He survived the war. He was highly intellectual, and he edited journals. He did a lot of deep stuff. He influenced Levinas. And after the war, he retired to a little village in the south of France, where he just carried on doing this philosophy. So these, and he in turn influenced someone called Jean-Luc Nancy, 1940 to 2021. So these are French intellectuals that I think are amazing. Blanchot talked about the importance of death and how philosophers have to cope with the fact of death and make sense of it. And if you think about evolution, in a sense it's premised on death, because individuals die out, but the species lives on. And although we grumble and say, no, we don't like that, that's the rule of nature, it seems. But does the soul live on? Is there some, I think the evidence is yes, it does. That I'm with Wallace on that, and with Allan Kardec, which is a Druid name, by the way. Allan Kardec, his real name was something different. He took that as a pseudonym because he channeled it through a medium. That's who he was in a former life. He was a Druid, and now he's the most famous philosopher in Brazil. In Brazil, the Spiritist tradition, of which there are 35 million people, including various presidents and stuff, they all follow Allan Kardec's teachings about the nature of the soul and reincarnation and evolution. And it's all druidical stuff. So I think this is fascinating stuff. The evolution, we love it.
I have one question.
Okay, go for it. Yeah.
Yes, it's about the rhythm of evolution. It seems that nowadays it's going faster and faster. What do you think about this?
That's a good point. Yes, I suppose we could talk about frequency. That life is a strange phenomena produced by it's a wave phenomena, right? And sound is a wave, light is a wave, the atoms are wave forms, they're waves and particles simultaneously. Everything is waving. So we are the product of wave forms of vibrations, and the higher the frequency, the faster they're working. So is it possible that mind is a wave phenomena? Is it possible that thought is a wave phenomena? Is it possible that soul, spirit, is a wave phenomena? And if so, is that increasing its frequency in some way? If you look at the number of inventions, say, and you take a timeline from the classical world through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, they start picking up, 18th century, more and more. And then you come to the 20th century and they're skyrocketing. Things like the internet, radio, television, all the stuff we take for granted. It's just, so it seems to me that there is an increased curve there of frequency. I'd like to see, when it comes to ethics, I'm not so sure the curve is that differentiated because, we still, in the middle of the 20th century we had Stalin, who was about as primitive as you can get in terms of revenge, hatred, killing off enemies, and Hitler, who was the same. And now I thought we'd gone beyond that and we were now on an ethical upward slope, but then we've had Gaza, and the mass slaughter of Palestinians and the inability to solve that. So my question would be about if goodness is a wave phenomena, how can we turn it up and get the frequency higher? I don't know, please let me know. But it's a very good question. Because the problem with Darwin is his view of evolution was survival of the fittest, which was a Victorian capitalist kind of idea that, the rich and powerful will survive, the slave owners, but the poor can just die off, to put it very simply. And whereas Wallace didn't agree with that idea of the survival of the fittest, he realised, yes, there is natural selection, but... Okay, so I've coined a word, I call it supernatural selection, which follows on from Wallace's idea. So, for instance, when two people fall in love, at a human level, there's a supernatural element in it. Most people have, when they fall in love, a sort of supernatural experience. It's the closest we get. And it seems to me that's when the souls are kicking in. And Shakespeare writes about this, when people fall in love, it's the stars that are doing it, So I think we humans have this supernatural selection going on as well, which no one has written about. That's why I edit this only journal in the world on the nature of love, which to me is a supernatural phenomenon, as for Teilhard de Chardin. So, and general system theory of evolution is Erwin Laszlo, that there's a hugely complex feedback mechanism in running evolution, which we can study through general systems theory. It's not just one thing doing it. It's everything cooperating. Nature is a symbiotic process. And in fact, our very bodies evolved by cells locking together. And if you analyse the parts of the cells, different parts of the cells locked in and became what we are now biologically sophisticated. And it's amazing. But I think, like Wallace, that there's a divine intelligence supervising it all in some way. Can't explain yet how. I don't think it's happened by chance. And I set up the Centre for the Study of Divine Intelligence in Scotland, in the castle, to try and say, what is that thing that is supervising it all? And how does it work,
So you don't think that human has made it up, really has made it religion up.
Oh non, non, non,
Non.
ça arrive des dieux, alors.
Alors.
C'est
How do you-
surnaturel.
How do
je
you
pense.
explain it?
Ah. C'est une question?
Yes.
Ah, alors, on va
Okay,
trouver,
okay.
on va trouver.
Oui.
Ça, c'est le mystère. But no, it's a good question, because is there an evolution of religions from less sophisticated? Yes, I think there are. I mean, in earlier times, cannibalism seemed like a good idea to some religions, or human sacrifice. You know, it was appeasing the gods, so, you know, you kill off your children or whatever. And then we grew out of that. And I think what's interesting about the religions like Judeo-Christian, Islamic religion, is they start out at a fairly primitive level. The earliest pages of the Bible are full of warfare and destruction and God wanting us to kill our neighbours. And and most cultures start out at a pretty primitive level, and then they do evolve. And I think, to me, that's why I quite like the New Testament. It seems to me that what Spirit was doing in the teachings through Christ was bringing in a law of love to replace the law of the jungle and violence and hatred. But you see that same move, say, in Indian religion. Earliest forms of Indian religion were again quite bloodthirsty. Human sacrifice was part of the Kali cult. Shiva didn't mind the odd human sacrifice. But then with Vedanta and philosophers like Shankara, it was an intellectual thing to reach enlightenment. You don't need to kill animals or kill humans to reach enlightenment. It's an internal journey of jnana yoga that we should be doing. And Buddha was part of that reaction against the old sort of killing cults. He was saying, no, to reach enlightenment you have to be non-violent. And Mahavira and the Jain religion was doing the same. So I think that there is a move towards ethical enlightenment in these religions. And that's, you know, what makes the table so interesting, because you can study them all and see the evolutionary map. But anyway, we'll come to that later. Let's look at the next one you mentioned, which was, I estimate there's a lot of people who followed evolution as an explanatory model, you know, still to this day. And it's in scientific academies and university departments, you know, it's the sort of the model that they follow. But I think there's more to it than they accept in the Darwinian mode. Okay, now we come to the one that you chose, which was new religious movement, called the New Age. 110.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, go on. I lost my question.
Well, it'll come back, don't worry.
Yes.
So, these new religious movements are interesting. It's a term we use in religious studies about, because religions aren't just the old ones, there are new ones coming into being. And this one, New Age religion, is quite eclectic. So we could say that Jacob Boehme, great German prophet, sage in the 18th century, was a New Age thinker, because he wanted a new kind of Christianity that was more esoteric, more profound than conventional stuff. William Blake is another example in English esoteric thought. He wanted a new world. Swedenborg influenced these thinkers in Sweden. He was a scientist who had certain spiritual experiences that convinced him of heaven and hell, and he could talk to spiritual beings. He was influential. Some of the French revolutionaries followed Swedenborg. They wanted a new age. That's what their revolution was about. They wanted a metaphysical new age. Like Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, who I talked about, who was inspired by Boehme. I believe he translated his works into French for the first time. And a lot of them were Freemasons, and that became a vehicle for esoteric people coming together. Swedenborg was also lived next door to a rabbi in London called Rabbi Falk, F-A-L-K, who was a New Age Jewish rabbi called the Baal Shem of London. The Baal Shem means the master of the name, Baal Shem Tov was the greatest Kabbalist in Ukraine, and this guy was the one in London. He was the neighbour of Swedenborg, and they would have discussed esoteric Kabbalah together. And it'd be lovely to have a record of their conversations. And Richard Falk had been accused of being a heretic by the Orthodox synagogues in the continent, so he fled to London, where he became, for those that know, he was quite important. 1800s, 1900s, Madame Blavatsky is quite an important figure for the New Age. She was a great Ukrainian, Russian esotericist who was a world traveller. She travelled in. She was married and she escaped from a rather bad marriage by horseback over the Caucasus Mountains as a young, early 20s something, and carried on till she got a ship to Istanbul, and threw herself headlong into the Ottoman esoteric movements, and in Cairo studied with Sufis. She was initiated into the Brotherhood of Luxor, which was an esoteric group in the 19th century, and she had mediumistic abilities. She could channel spirit beings. And she went also to New York, where she met similar circles, a man called Colonel Olcott, an American former Union general and a friend of Abraham Lincoln, who was into spiritualism. Colonel Olcott decided Blavatsky was amazing, and they set up a thing called the Theosophical Society together in 1875 to research anomalous phenomena scientifically and religiously. They were way ahead of the time. And they went then to India, met lots of different Indian spiritual teachers, and got the world headquarters near Madras in Chennai, which I've been to. There's a mystery about Blavatsky. Did she go to Tibet? I think she did. A friend of mine, Jean Overton Fuller, wrote a biography of Blavatsky. Jean Overton Fuller was an amazing woman who did an awful lot of research on this, and she can prove, I've got the book, that Blavatsky was one of the first people to get into Tibet. She studied in Shigatse with the Panchen Lama. Most people don't know about the Panchen Lama. He was the wisdom teacher. The Dalai Lama is only the political head of Tibetan Buddhism. Panchen Lama is the guy that actually knows the stuff. And so the masters, the Mahatmas that Blavatsky was taught by, they were people in the ashram of the Panchen Lama. And it's all explained by Overton Fuller's book. And they were teaching, what's the Theosophical Society about? It was about creating a world where there's no class war, no class distinctions, whether you're rich or poor, it doesn't matter to the masters. There's no racial distinctions, so it doesn't matter if you're European or Indian or American Indian or Egyptian, or Druze or whatever, or Chinese. It's what wisdom you have that you can cultivate that matters. And all the races have wonderful things about them. And then that there shouldn't be a war between science and religion, because Blavatsky lived in a time when the Darwinists were really dominant, and they were coming out and saying, all religion's bunk, we hate it, let's kill all the priests. And in the form of Leninism and Marxism, that became a real, let's shut the churches down and kill all the religions. Whereas Blavatsky was saying, no, let's science and religion work together. Like we need a right and a left leg. We need rationality and science, but we also need spirituality and intuition. So she inspired a lot of people, and that influence lives on. Another New Age thinker would be Rudolf Steiner, who was he was the head of the Theosophical Society for Germany in Berlin for some years. When Blavatsky died, there was a shift, and a woman called Annie Besant took over the Theosophical Society with a man called Charles Ledbetter, and they took it in a direction towards Indian thought. And Steiner didn't agree with that. As a German, Central European, he wanted the esoteric Christian side to be more important. So there was a split. He set up the Anthroposophical Society to study kind of esoteric Christianity. And whereas Besant studied more the esoteric Indian ideas. It's a shame that split happened, but I suppose it's part of evolution that cells split and they generate multiple forms. I was influenced by a man called Sir George Trevelyan, who was one of the founders of the New Age in Britain. He was a member of the Anthroposophical Society. So in my 20s, I was the librarian at the Anthroposophical Society in London, with help from... and I threw myself into studying Steiner's works, which are all in German, most of them, and it taught me how to read German. And then I decided to go to university and study history and get my degree, because I believe in universal wisdom, not just one particular branch, or and I was a heretic because I joined the Theosophical Society, used their library, and the Anthroposophical Society, and used their library, and became the librarian. And I just want them all to talk to each other and get on. The other one that's influential in the New Age theory is Alice Bailey. She was a Scottish mystic who channeled the masters, and she wrote a series of about 30 books channeled by a Tibetan called Djwhal Khul. I have them all here, and he was one of the ashram in the Panchen Lama's place in Shigatse that Blavatsky met. Alice Bailey received these teachings telepathically. I never met her, she was dead before I came along, but I know people that knew her. She was quite a profound woman. She ended up in California in the Theosophical Society and set up her own thing called World Goodwill, which has offices in London and Geneva and Tokyo, I believe, and California. Another example would be the work of Peter Caddy in Findhorn, up in the north of Scotland. It's a New Age centre for visiting esoteric students from all over the world. Eileen Caddy and Peter were just, channeling the divine and set up this beautiful centre. I've visited there several times and given talks there. That was quite influential. So, and I think Jung is also part of the fabric of New Age thinking. He wanted a Christianity that was more sensitive to the reality of the psyche than the dogmas of 3rd century Trinitarian thought. Much as we love the Church Fathers, they missed some things. They missed the importance of the goddess. They missed the feminine side of reality. They missed some of the aspects of the pagan traditions that were very, very profound. And the kind of fanatical Christians that killed Hypatia is disgraceful. The anti-pagan fanatics, who also shut the Delphic Games down, by the way, and closed the Delphic Oracle, I just think got it wrong, and I think Jung knew that. And so that's why he promoted a study of Gnosticism, which I've also done commentaries on the Gnostic Gospels. And Jung was fascinated by the Gnostic Gospels. So in a sense, the New Age was already there in the Gnostic Christian circles at the time of Christ. In fact, the first use of the term New Age is in the Gospel of John, where the term is the new eon that Christ is trying to deliver to humanity. So other thinkers like Nicholas Roerich, Gurdjieff, and many others we could say qualify as New Age thinking. David Bohm was a scientist who was interested in Krishnamurti's work, and Krishnamurti was a protege of the Theosophical Society. So yeah, it lives on, it's still going on. A colleague of mine did a PhD on the New Age, and his work is quite important because he edited the amazing Encyclopedia of Gnostic and Western Esotericism